Asus has just introduced a 10 gigabit Ethernet adapter for $99. Is this the price break necessary to get content creators moving to 10 gig Ethernet? Let's check it out. Welcome to Gadget Blues. This is Casey, and today we are taking a look at the new $99 10 gigabit Ethernet adapter from Asus, the C100C. Now, this is basically a generic adapter based on the Aquantia 107 chipset, which Aquantia announced was going to be around $130 for cards, and that sounded like a great deal, but Asus actually shipped this at $99, which is a much better deal. This is important not just because of the price breakthrough from Asus on this specific card, but the fact that we're going to be seeing this Aquantia 107 chip on a lot of motherboards, since Aquantia seems to be making some very aggressive OEM pricing. The Aquantia chip supports not only 10 gigabit, but of course 1 gigabit Ethernet, and also nbase-t, which provides 2.5 and 5 gigabit, and I'll get to that after the benchmarks because that's another whole story that isn't really ready for prime time right at the moment. What matters right now is the performance of this card. Is it worth $99? Should you look at an Intel option instead? How does this all come together? We're comparing the Asus Aquantia-based card versus two generations of Intel 10 gigabit adapter, the X540T and the X550T. The X550T is the gold standard for 10 gigabit copper, but it is about $315, so well over 3 times the price as the new Asus card. Both the Asus card and the X550 are PCI Express X4 because they are using PCI Express 3.0. And the older X540, while it has basically the same performance as the newer X550, is PCI Express 2.0, so it has an X8 that has exactly the same bus speed as 4 lanes of 3.0. Back when I first got the X550 for my primary machine, I tested it against the 540 and I couldn't really see any significant speed difference. The new card just has lower power consumption and PCI Express 3.0. More on all of that in a couple of minutes, but first let's get right to the benchmarks. I tested the Asus Aquantia in sequential file copy. So this is not going to be a review for IT people that have a lot of folks editing documents directly on their server or doing transaction-based stuff. I'm not doing IOPS. I'm only doing sequential file copy because content creators care about copying that 60, 100 gig file to and from their server as quickly as possible. To that end, I did the benchmark by copying a 49 gigabyte uncompressible media file. That file took an average of 59.3 seconds to copy on the X550T1 and 80.3 seconds to copy on the Asus Aquantia. That gives us roughly a throughput of 610 megabytes per second on the Asus and 825 megabytes per second on the X550. There aren't any bottlenecks in my setup because I'm using an NVMe SSD on the client with more than 2,500 megs per second of throughput and a RAID 6 array on a Mega RAID with caching and so forth on the server that has a local ATO benchmark in excess of 1,000. So 610 megabytes versus 825 megabytes per second. The consistency of the copy was also very different between the two cards. The consistency was very good on the Intel with the line of megabytes per second going very smoothly across, but on the Aquantia, every time was pretty much the same deal. It started off right up at 1,000 megabytes per second. It would drop down all the way to 300 and something, and then back up to the mid 600s and flatline at that the rest of the copy. What that indicates to me is that this thing is thermal throttling. They don't really disclose the power draw on this. Intel says that the X550 is 8 watts. Aquantia says that this is 3 watts, but they spec that at 5 gig per second, not 10 gig per second. So we don't really know what the power consumption of this is at 10 gig. And if you can see the thermal pad in there's a fairly thick thermal pad there between the chip and this fairly basic aluminum heatsink. And I think that the thermal pad is the limiting factor here, because when I suspected thermal throttling, I got out a big Delta fan with huge CFM and propped it up on a box with the side of the case open, blowing directly at this card, and I saw absolutely no difference. So it doesn't look like it's this heatsink itself that is the problem, it's the thermal interface. When I have some time, I want to tear this thing apart and see if I can modify this to make these standoffs shorter so I can put some Arctic Silver or something on the chip and see if we get more consistent performance. But bear that in mind if you're looking at one of these cards, or the motherboard solution, which probably won't have a heatsink on it at all in some cases. I think the Aquantia cards that they've shown don't have heatsinks. And that really seems to be what is letting this down. It is definitely capable of doing 1,000 megabytes per second, but it is showing a pattern that is very indicative of thermal throttling to me. If it isn't thermal throttling, it would have to be retries, cable problems, or something like that. But all of these cables work perfectly on the X540s, X550s, and so forth. And it's only about 30 feet of Cat6A cabling, which I should be able to use 100 meters of. So I don't really think there's any problem with my cables. It's probably thermally related. So with those numbers of 600 versus 800 megs per second, this thing is roughly 75% as fast as the X550, but the X550 costs more than 3 times as much. So this is definitely a great deal at 99 bucks. No question about that. However, there might be another factor to consider, and that's the X540. While the X540 is a last generation card with higher power consumption and more cooling required, it is just as fast as the 550. And there are a lot of these that are pulls out of enterprise systems that those enterprises then turn around and flip on eBay. So you can get these for as little as $125. Generally, the going price is between $125 and $170 on eBay. So if you can pick one of these up for $125 versus $99 for the one that does 600 megs, that is probably a good deal too. Of course, you don't get the same kind of warranty on that, and you have to be aware that you're going to have to put this in X16 slot, because if your motherboard has an X4 slot, this won't fit in it, being an X8 card. The other two will fit in an X4 slot. All of that aside, for 99 bucks with warranty and current drivers and so on and so forth, this is definitely a stellar deal. This brings the price of 10 gigabit way down into near mainstream territory. And Asus is helping move that along with their 10 gigabit switch. More about that in a second. Just to wind up the benchmarking discussion, a couple of things to note is I always go through and set 9K jumbo frames in the drivers and max out the send and receive buffers. And I did that on all these cards for testing. You will get dramatically less performance if you don't have jumbo frames enabled. So that's the first thing that you should do. I'm using the Netgear XS708E 8-port 10 gig switch, which can be had for about 650 bucks. So it's a pretty good price per port for 10 gig on the switch side. I did find a bug in the Aquantia 107 drivers though while doing that. If you set the transmit buffers on this to the maximum of 8192, this thing will fail to obtain an IP address. Now, even if you go one step down to 8183 instead of 8192, it works perfectly. So they clearly have a little buffer math error there. It might even be a security vulnerability, come to think of it. But bear that in mind. The first thing I do when testing any of these cards is to max out the send and receive buffers, because who cares about a couple of megabytes of memory when we have systems that have 32, 64 gigs of RAM. Moving on to talk a little bit about 10 gigabit infrastructure and getting started. There are some other videos you find on YouTube about getting started with 10 gig. I just want to make a couple of comments. The absolute cheapest way of getting started with 10 gig is with surplus switches and cards that use SFP plus Direct Connect. But that is, in all practical purposes, about a 5-meter cable length. So you need to have your workstation and your server very close to each other. And the problem is that there aren't any fanless 10 gigabit switches except this Asus with 2 ports. So if you want more than 2 ports, you're going to have to go with a 1U unit that has really noisy fans. So the problem with the SFP Plus strategy is you are going to be really close to a very noisy switch. If you have some sort of situation where you can have the switch in a closed closet so it doesn't bother you, that's fine. But if you're a content creator, you really want to have a quiet workspace. So the 100-meter limitation of Cat6a lets you get the switch a lot farther away from you than the SFP+. Of course, this new Aquantia is a big advantage for copper cabling because at $99, you can't get an SFP Plus card for much less than that, and the SFP Plus card is going to be an old thing with old drivers and really hot running. So overall, this is a much better bet. What's really going to make this card interesting, and the whole family of Aquantia 107s, is if someone finally gets a reasonably priced fanless switch with 5 gig or even 2.5 gig capability. I mentioned that nbase-t earlier, and this card, unlike the Intel 540, but like the Intel 550, both of these are nbase-t capable, meaning that they can run at 5 and 2.5. And the 5 gigahertz will work over a lot of Cat5e cables, and the 2.5 will work over basically all of them. So that would be a huge advantage if we had a nice fanless 8-port plus switch. Unfortunately, right now, the only switches that support nbase-t are switches that are designed for aggregation of the new AC Wave 2 access points. And so they're PoE switches, and they're very expensive per port. Hopefully, Aquantia and or Asus are working on fanless 8-port 5 gig switches or 2.5 gig switches, because if they had that fanless at an appropriate price point and you could get faster than 1 gig over existing Cat5e cabling, that would be a huge bonus. Related to that, you can get 5 gig over Cat5e by connecting 2 of these cards directly. You have to mess around with your routing a little bit and networking, but that is an option to get greater throughput between locations in your network without having to get new cabling. So to sum up, this is a terrific deal. I have to recommend this at $99. The driver seems solid. It has lower throughput, 3/4 the throughput of this card, but it's less than 1/3 the cost of the Intel. The X540 on eBay is another option that you should check out, but all told, recommended. I'll have more on this in future videos, so subscribe and like, and we'll see you in the next Gadget Blues.